I'm unmuting so that you can see me at the top. And then I am going to start letting people in. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We are just allowing people a time to start entering and coming into this Prenatal to 3 forum. Thank you for being here this morning. All right, welcome everyone to our Prenatal to 3 Policy Forum. I am Bonnie England. I'm an assistant professor at the University of St. Thomas in the School of Education. My focus is in early childhood special education. And I just want to welcome all of you here tonight to this wonderful, wonderful forum. I really appreciate all the work that everyone in this group does to really support our young families that we have in Minnesota. There is so much good work being done in these programs. I love the bipartisan nature of everything that is going on. And I appreciate that all of you are here today to continue this work and continue supporting young children and their families. Today in this webinar, you will be muted if you are an attendee, but if you have any questions, we appreciate your questions and would love to answer them. That you will use that Q&A function in order to do this so that we can really hear all of your wonderful questions. And so we are going to move forward with Deb Fitzpatrick.
And I will.
Good morning.
I'm going to go ahead. Yes, welcome, Deb. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Deb Fitzpatrick. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at Children's Defense Fund, Minnesota. I have the humbling task of updating everyone here this morning on what's happening over at the state capitol. And it's a very, very important week, very important day, a very fluid situation. So I'm going to share some really high level kind of summaries of where we're at, but recognizing that literally as I'm speaking, things are going to be evolving as we see budget bills dropping. Some of those dropped late last night. So obviously, some of the things that I'm going to share may even be outdated by the time I get done talking. So we'll just have that in mind as we have this discussion this morning. So next slide, please. Wanted to just start by highlighting some of the high level areas where we've had a lot of discussion across the governor's budget proposal, the House and the Senate, and a little bit about kind of where we see the kind of prenatal to 3 elements coming into these discussions. The first one is workforce. This has just been an ongoing concern across, again, a variety of committees, a variety of spaces, that we see workforce shortages and a lot of concern about supply and the diversity of the people who are working in some of the areas that in particular affect the prenatal to 3 space. We know that childcare, for example, other areas of the care sector that really impact our prenatal to 3 community are seeing real challenges attracting and keeping staff, as well as having a diversity of staff to meet the needs of different kinds of families. And then another big area where there's just been a lot of discussion is how much of the budget surplus should go back to families in some kind of broad way through the direct payments or ongoing income tax cuts. Obviously, these aren't directly affecting our prenatal to 3 area, but obviously they affect our young families. And then a lot of attention to mental health and a lot of bipartisan discussion and coming together around the need to address, as I think everybody here knows, the American Academy of Pediatrics has declared this an emergency situation of mental health. So there's just a lot of interest and proposals in that space. And then finally, just a big issue that's been brought up quite a lot is the UI Trust Fund and refilling that. And there's been an agreement around reinsurance, which helps keep our health insurance sector stable. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start just kind of laying out some of the big, again, overarching proposals that are in the mix at this stage in the process, starting with the Walz-Flanagan administration's supplemental budget proposal. The governor had put forward a very historic, comprehensive $5.1 billion investment in families and children, 1.8 of that for mixed delivery, childcare, and early education. The major proposals relate to CCAP, 75th percentile, basic sliding fee, expanding the family definition, hardship grants for providers, a new kind of way of thinking about mixed delivery of a 4-year-old pre-K, combining existing programs, early learning scholarships, again, that workforce component showing up here. And then other areas of the budget that have an important impact include paid family medical leave. The governor included startup of that program, universal home visiting, early childhood and other mental health investments, homelessness, expansion of the homework starts at home to 0 to 5, funding of the community solutions for healthy child development, and others. We're going wrong direction. Okay, and then finally, continuous MA coverage for all children 0 to 20. Next slide, please. On the House side, this is really a work in progress. As we know, these bills are dropping literally right now. We're expecting a number of bills to drop in the House today. But what we do know is that the House has made a commitment of $1.7 billion to front load a paid family and medical leave insurance program. There's been a lot of conversation, again, about frontline workers, but just to lift up that in the House proposal, those do include childcare workers. And then again, almost all of these proposals that are listed here are pending the dropping of bills, which is literally going to be occurring today. But we do know that the mixed delivery, the governor's mixed delivery 4-year-old pre-K is in the House bill that's being heard in education right now. But we also expect, again, based on historic commitments to the kind of variety of programs that serve our earliest learners, CCAP, early learning scholarships, and stabilization grants for providers. We expect some of those things to be showing up when that bill drops later today. Finally, also, again, there's been a number of hearings on mental health, home visiting, Minnesota Family Investment Program reforms, basic needs, housing, food, healthcare. So again, we'll be expecting to see the final details of those bills later today. Next slide, please. On the Senate side, there's been a lot of discussion about their budget priorities being tax cuts, broad-based tax cuts. Earlier, the proposals that were submitted earlier, again, those are going to be voted on this week and brought up in committee over on the Senate this week, but about $8.5 billion in tax cuts. And then also a commitment around long-term care workforce has been kind of an overarching issue. In the early care and education space, we expect there might be some ECFE changes to bring some money to the state, to the MDE, to basically have some leadership at MDE on in this space. We are expecting some modifications of the stabilization grant formula to shift some support to family child care. Maybe see a permanent reprioritization of the CCAP basic sliding fee wait list, maybe some facilities money in the bonding, and perhaps a workforce study. In other areas, the Senate has come forward with some ideas on the paid family and medical leave front, largely partial tax credits for either family leave or parental leave. Out-of-home placements and families first has been a focus, as well as, again, those mental health investments. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, there's a number of bills dropping or being heard this week. Some of those may make it to the floor on the Senate side this week. The tax bill, there's been talk about that reaching the floor this week. But otherwise, those will probably be hitting the floor of the House and Senate after their break, which is next week. And then we expect conference committees to be taking up those bills in early to mid-May. And finally, the last day of regular session is May 22nd. So we expect some kind of resolution to be achieved by that point. Just a quick reminder at this point that this is not a budget year. So if the agreement can't be reached on many of the items that we had already talked about, we would, we wouldn't need special sessions because we do have a budget in place, and the money would just, the surplus would then just be set aside for the next legislature to consider. Next slide, please. Finally, just want to remind everybody that it's really, really important that you share your views. Like I said, this week, there's going to be a lot of conversation about what is going to end up in these omnibus bills. So it's really, really important that you take the time to contact your legislators. We'll be sharing some opportunities, some places where you can learn about which bills are in play, and also how you can contact your legislators. We'll be sending that out following the webinar today. So, if we want early childhood, prenatal to 3 to be part of the conversation, we really do need to raise our voice and make sure that it's heard at the state capitol. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions or conversation. I know we've got a couple of legislators on as well. And some other folks in the wings if I can't answer the questions. So looking forward to see if you have any questions.
That's wonderful. Deb, thank you so much. Deborah Fitzpatrick is one of a host of EC advocates, and we really appreciate your taking on this rather large task. We do have about 10 minutes, and I want to call on Representative Pinto, who's got his, maybe, do you have anything you want to add to the conversation? Not really. Okay. We're looking for Q&A, and is there one that's come in? I'm just... Nothing at this point. This is a kind of like a moving train, and we've asked you to take a snapshot, and we really appreciate that. We're going to give people just a few minutes. And while we're waiting to see if we have any other questions, I just want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Jane Kressman. I work with the Elders for Infants, and we have been doing quarterly virtual forums now for 2 years. And I just want to let you know that by July 13th is when we are going to reconvene on the St. Thomas campus in person at 9 a.m. for a full morning. And we really look forward to that. That'll give us a chance to reconnect and rebuild some relationships and also continue to share plans. So I'm just going to check here. Okay, so we've had a request. Can we send a link of today's recording to the Start Early funders to share with their parent and provider advisory group? Definitely. And following this, the webinar, within a week, we will have the entire program posted and a video shared. So that's great. There's one additional question, and sorry.
It says, are there any action alerts that folks are putting out this week?
So the question is, are there action alerts that are being put out this week? And again, I think we can send out a link to the early childhood advocates, which we can do fairly quickly to our listserv. If I'm looking at my technological group, that you'll be able to see where the links are. So yes, very important question and very important time. So I'm going to breathe for a second, but now I think it's time for us to move forward. One of the great and important areas of the purposes of the Prenatal to 3 Policy Forum is to build knowledge. And most of us in the work have had some exposure to the science of brain development and the importance of investing early. But we also find ourselves with scientific discoveries that lead us to the question of, so now what? What do we do now that we hear what the science is telling us to do? Where is the evidence about what policies work best at the state level? And fortunately, a few years ago, the National Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center made this its mission. And I am just can't tell you how thrilled Elders for Infants are to welcome Dr. Cynthia Osborne, who is a professor of early childhood education and policy and the executive director of the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center, now at Vanderbilt University. And we are really, first want to say to everybody, you're going to be on a rather intense ride today, but to reassure you, number one, that there will be slides afterwards that you can reference and you can re-listen to the recording. And what we're going to be hearing about today is Minnesota's roadmap, state roadmap for prenatal to 3. And we want to, I guess, remind ourselves that this is a mirror on Minnesota. It's a window on other states, and that this is not about shame and blame. This is about learn. And how can we continue to be a learning community both here and nationally? And we've just got one of the greatest teachers with us this morning. So Cynthia Osborne, it is your turn at the podium, and we thank you so much for being here.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for asking me to join you. This group is so important in terms of really leading the way in supporting infants and toddlers and their parents. And so I'm just thrilled to be able to be part of this conversation. I'm going to share my screen and present some slides. But as Jane mentioned, there will be a lot that I'll be sharing, but I promise that the slides are available and that we will have time for Q&A at the end. And so I don't expect, there's not a pop quiz at the end of all this. It's an open note for sure, but looking forward to the conversation. So as Jane mentioned, I have the privilege of directing the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center, and our whole goal is to be a resource for states as they develop and implement the most effective policies that they can to ensure that all children get off to a healthy start and thrive. And that includes focusing on their parents as well. And for this group, I'm not going to go into much about the science of the developing child, except to say that that really is what motivates our work. That the science is, as Dr. Shonkoff says, screaming at us about how important the first 3 years of a child's life are for setting the stage for subsequent development. And if we are serious about investing in children's development, then it's important that we invest when children are developing the most. And we know that the first 3 years is the most sensitive and rapid period of development. But what also most motivates our work is that there are millions of children in every, comprising in every state that lack the opportunities that they deserve for this healthy start. And unfortunately, systematically, it's children of color and children from lower socioeconomic statuses that often do not have these warm, nurturing, stable, loving environments that are necessary for optimal brain development. And this lack of opportunity is driven by state policy choices. And we know that our state policy choices can empower parents and support children's healthy development. But we can't just focus on the kids, particularly in this earliest stages of development, that we do have to focus on the caregivers as well so that they can care for the children. And that to do this, the research is clear that it requires a system of support, including both broad-based economic and family supports and more targeted interventions. There's no magic bullet. There's no one policy or program that's going to do it all. And so figuring out how to create this system that works together to support families and their children is really what's so important. But today, there's such variation across the country, and our state policy choices really lead to this patchwork of benefits and outcomes for children and their parents. So based on that science of the developing child, we identify these 8 prenatal to 3 policy goals. And they are broad and specific simultaneously. So one, it's making sure that families have access to the services that they're eligible for, that parents have the ability to both work and care for their children, that children are living in situations of economic security, including financial security, food security, housing security, and so forth. That our children are born healthy to healthy parents, and that parents have the knowledge and ability to provide those nurturing interactions that really stimulate early brain development. And that when children are not with their parents, that they are also in these nurturing, loving environments. And that when we identify a developmental delay, that we are able to treat that delay quickly to be able to get a child back on track. So if we can provide all of these conditions, we know that children will thrive. So for each of those policy goals, we turn to the research to identify a limited number of indicators that would help us to see how states are doing on these various goals. Again, it's not comprehensive. There's lots of things that we would want to look for, but we know that these data, 1, are available, but 2, they're highly predictive of well-being across the life course. And this also helps states to identify areas in which they are strong and areas in which they have room to grow. But importantly, there are some things to look at. This is just where states are. It doesn't necessarily point to where states need to be. So this is 4 of the goals here. And you can see with Minnesota that one of the areas of improvement could be on making sure that families have access to the benefits that they're eligible for. But even on developmental screening, in which the data show that children in Minnesota have the highest levels of developmental screening, there's still 40% of children who are not getting those age-appropriate screens that help us to identify the issues early and connect them with the services that they need. So just because we're far to the right, that means that you're ahead of others in the country, but it doesn't mean that it's all the place that we need to be for children's development. So to just keep that in mind. And again, if we look at these other outcomes, that this gives you kind of a sense of overall well-being of infants and toddlers and parents in your state. And this is just aggregate. This does not demonstrate the differences by race, ethnicity. Those data are not always available, at least in a reliable way. But systematically, almost to the outcome, children of color are not experiencing the same level of benefits or same level of outcomes as white children. And so they're often always performing worse. And that's something that we want to pay particular attention to, is what are the policies that will close the gaps and disparities, or disparities in outcomes rather, excuse me. So as Jane mentioned, the research is clear. We've looked at outcomes. We know how we're doing, but so what? What do we do about it? How do we create the conditions in which children thrive? And so as a research institute, we began, again, grounding ourselves in that science. We're doing this because we are committed to reducing disparities and promoting greater equity. And we wanted to be guided by what the most rigorous evidence tells us about what works. We do recognize that the evidence base needs to continue to grow, and there's so much left to learn, but this at least helps us to understand what we know to date. And so we reviewed thousands and thousands of articles and hundreds of rigorous studies and did comprehensive reviews of these policies to identify the most effective policies and strategies that states can implement that do help children get off to this healthy start and thrive. And we created a prenatal to 3 state policy roadmap. And I invite you all to visit our website and check it out. There is a lot of information and a lot of data there. And I'm going to give a very high-level overview and summary of it today. In the interest of time, I'll go through things pretty quickly. And again, I'll come back for any questions that you might have. But in addition to providing a broad overview, we go into the specifics on each of the effective policies and strategies. So they each have their own profile and information based on your state. So with Minnesota, we have Minnesota's roadmap. Again, the overall summary of how Minnesota is doing in terms of adopting and implementing these effective policies, as well as more detailed information about each one of them with information on how you could perhaps improve. So I also just bring your attention to what we call our framework, which aligns those policy goals. And remember, the goals are driven by the science of the developing child. We are not neutral to those. Those are the ones that tell us what the conditions are that children need in order to thrive. We are neutral to what the policies are. We're guided by the evidence, meaning that if there was something else that works, and that's what's going to go on here. We're not advocating for any specific policy because we just like it. We're putting it on the roadmap because the research says that it works. But again, that not any one policy is going to affect every goal, but this helps to demonstrate that alignment so that if you are advocating for a particular policy, you'll understand the benefits that it could have. Or if you want to focus on a particular goal, for instance, making sure that children are born healthy, then you would understand the policies that are best aligned to doing that. And again, we do that with our strategies as well. Now, the difference between a policy and a strategy, they both work. They are both effective. They both have to meet the same level of rigor in studies. However, the research with regard to a policy gives us guidance about how states should actually implement that policy, what they would need to do, what is the level of benefit that they would need to set, and so forth. Whereas for some of the strategies, they're a bit more targeted, and the research isn't as clear as to exactly what the optimal level of implementation is from a state perspective. So for instance, with our evidence-based home visiting programs, the evidence says that they do work in terms of improving outcomes for parents, in parenting outcomes rather, but the research isn't clear on exactly how much you should fund and the way that you should fund it and so forth. So that's the difference between a policy and a strategy. And with the 5 policies, you can see that across the country, there's a wide variation in terms of the full-on implementation of these at the state level. And Minnesota has adopted and fully implemented 3 out of those 5 policies, and I'll go into that in more detail. But we're also tracking states' progress over time. And last year, 5 states fully implemented at least 1 more of the roadmap policies, and Missouri actually implemented 2 of them. So we understand that policy is a long game and doesn't always happen every session. And so in addition to kind of a snapshot in time, we also are documenting each year the extent to which that policy was introduced and discussed, and was it a almost, or was it something that wasn't even considered? And that helps to really track over time where the level of interest is in these policies. So I'm going to go through each of them quickly, but this is just to kind of illustrate to you the type of information that's available in the roadmap. So one of the most effective policies that ensure that children thrive from the start and that benefits the household in terms of greater resources and access to health insurance is the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. And Minnesota was one of the first 6 states to expand Medicaid. Now the conversation is not just about getting these last states to expand Medicaid, but with the American Rescue Plan Act, states are permitted to extend Medicaid coverage for parents for 12 months postpartum. So that's the discussion at play now across the country in terms of whether states will do this. For each of the policies and strategies in the roadmap, we provide information that is kind of straight out of the most rigorous studies about what the impact of that policy is on these various outcome measures that are so important. And we're hoping that these can be used by advocates or state policy leaders to really understand what they might expect from the benefits of these policies. And we also illustrate, when it's available, whether the policies have an impact on reducing disparities in outcomes. And Medicaid is one of those policies that does help to reduce disparities in access to health insurance and to reduce disparities in birth outcomes, which we know that especially Black infants and Black mothers are much more likely to die 4 times as likely as their white or Hispanic counterparts, and states that expand Medicaid have actually seen a reduction in those gaps. In addition to providing information on why the policy is important and whether it works or not, and whether the state has adopted and fully implemented it, we also provide data on the generosity and reach of the policies, is where that information is available. So for Medicaid expansion, for states that have not expanded Medicaid, no childless adults are eligible for Medicaid. So if you don't have a child, you do not get Medicaid. If you did expand Medicaid, you are eligible for Medicaid if you are a childless adult. And this is really important for women who may become pregnant, who are not yet parents, but they are able then to have health insurance before conception, and then to be able to switch to pregnancy Medicaid much more readily. However, among states that have not adopted Medicaid, some parents are eligible. In Minnesota, because you have adopted Medicaid, parents up to 138% of the poverty line are eligible for Medicaid. Those above that can buy into the marketplace. But in states that haven't adopted it, like Texas, a parent would have to have an income at 17% of the federal poverty line or below, so no more than $300 a month in income, in order to access Medicaid. And that she is not at that point eligible to buy into the marketplace until her income is above 130%. So that's why you see these huge differences across states in the proportion of women, and we look at low-income women of childbearing age, all who would be eligible for Medicaid if the state expanded it, to you see these variations in who has access. Now, Minnesota is certainly in the top half of states, unlike the state that I'm actually currently in. I'm moving to Tennessee quickly. But in Texas, nearly half of women of these women do not have access to health insurance. In Minnesota, it's a little over 13%. And so that says that there are women out there who are eligible for Medicaid today. that if you could reach them and help them to get sign up for the program, that then they could access a benefit that they are actually eligible for. So SNAP is the example that we give, but the policy is really about reducing administrative burden. It is making it so that for families who are eligible for any particular benefit, they're able to access it in the most, the least intrusive way. And we use SNAP as the example because it is the most effective food nutrition program that we have. It provides benefit of up to $500 a month on average for families, and it reduces food insecurity by over a third. And Minnesota could do more to ensure that families who are eligible for SNAP are actually receiving it. And so although Minnesota does have a 12-month recertification period, which is good because it allows families to go for a longer period before they have to kind of come back in and show that they're still eligible. The simplified reporting, which means that you only have to report a change in income if it would change your eligibility, is only available to some families, especially families with young children. So that's a way to extend that. And you can see that there's about 13%, again, of families who are eligible for this benefit, that if we could reach them, we could get them on that, that provides substantial resources for their family. A paid family leave program is the policy that is on our roadmap that impacts the largest number of policy goals. To date, there are 6 states in which families actually can access that benefit. There are 4 additional states that have adopted that policy, and they are taking time to roll it out. It'll be available for some next year and over the next several years. And there are a lot of other states who are considering this, and I know that Minnesota is one of those states. But this is a program that has substantial benefits for both the mother and the baby. It allows a mother to take a break after having a child before returning back to work. And that is especially true for Black and Hispanic mothers, who are the least likely to be able to take the family medical leave program that from the federal government, because that is unpaid. And so providing at least 6 weeks of paid leave, and I emphasize this point, the research was mostly done on California's paid leave program. That was 6 weeks until just recently that it's increased now to 8 weeks and will be going up to 10 weeks. But the more and more the research is indicating that 10 to 12 weeks is really the optimal amount of time. But it's also one of the most pro-work policies that we have. It increases maternal labor force participation. It makes it so that women are more likely to go back to the job that they left. And a year later, the probability that a mom is working is nearly 20 percentage points higher, which is just larger than any other program that we have in terms of being pro-work. It also increases the level of resources in a household substantially. It reduces so much of the stress with regard to trying to work and parent, especially in those first several months. And you see that in better outcomes for the mom in terms of being overweight, reductions in alcohol. It also increases that quality time and interaction between the mother and the child. And it leads to better children's outcomes, exposure to breastfeeding and immunizations, and it actually has a reduction in early head trauma or head trauma among infants and toddlers. So this is a program that has substantial benefits across a range of outcomes. And the way that it's, I don't expect you to read this, please, right now. It's just to illustrate the type of information that we have available in the roadmap, and we go into even greater detail in that section. But it demonstrates or illustrates how across across the 10 states that have adopted this policy, how it varies so much. It varies in the number of weeks that folks have available to them for leave, in the reimbursement level, and who's eligible. All of those have implications for equity as well. It also varies quite a bit about how it's funded. So in most states, it's a combination of employer and employee contributions. In one state, it's all the employer has to pay for it. And in some states, it's all the employee through an insurance program, but it's all the employee that has to pay for it. And there's also variation in terms of whether a state had to set up a whole new infrastructure or whether they could tie into an existing infrastructure. And all of these have implications for how long it takes to roll it out and kind of at the amount that it costs as well. So this is just the type of information that we have available. And again, as I know that you're considering that policy, that might be something that could be helpful. A minimum wage of at least $10 an hour is also an important policy for both improving household resources, but it also impacts the well-being of infants in terms of reducing low birth weight and decreasing neonatality, post-mortality, pardon me. And this is a policy that has a significant reduction in child neglect reports. And that is something that is, as you know, most of child welfare cases involve child neglect, which is often related to living in poverty and not having anything to do with actually physically abusing your child. So Minnesota is just over that $10 mark, but there are lots of states who are still at the federal minimum of $7.25 an hour, and there will be a half dozen states that will be over $15 an hour within the next 4 years. And then a refundable earned income tax credit that's at least 10% of the federal credit is also one of the most effective policies that states can implement. And this is something that Minnesota has. This is a policy that, when kind of implemented effectively, actually improves birth outcomes and helps to reduce disparities in birth outcomes. It reduces the stressors on the parents, increases the level of resources in the household. But it's also one of the most pro-work policies. In addition to paid family leave, it allows it incentivizes families to be in the workforce and allows them to keep in the workforce and to benefit from their work by increasing their household's resources. All right, so I'm going to shift from policies to strategies, and I just want to be very mindful of the time. My apologies, I could talk about this for hours. But the issue about the strategies, again, is what we're looking at here in order for a state to really be a leader is that they are investing in it and they're able to serve a large number of those who could benefit from it. One of the most effective strategies is these universal programs that conduct comprehensive screenings and connect families to the resources that they need. And the reason why they're so important is that, one, they're universal. Everyone has some level of need. But importantly is that they identify what that level of need is, and they offer families what they need instead of just what we have. And so Minnesota has a Family Connects programs and a Healthy Steps program that are both effective at improving outcomes. But again, the reach of those programs is one of the things that we would want to pay attention to. In the group prenatal care model, this is a program that does have benefits to the mom and the child in terms of providing more of a social support during the pregnancy period, and has benefits for the child in terms of increasing breastfeeding initiation and so forth. And Minnesota does have some group prenatal care programs, but only a very small fraction to date of mothers are able to benefit from that program. It's not offered very widely across the state. Our evidence-based home visiting programs, relative to other states, Minnesota, pardon me, is kind of, you know, on the top half of states, but only about 11, close to 12% of families are served by our evidence-based home visiting programs. Whereas there are some states that are serving 20% or more. But these are programs that we know can benefit children in terms of helping the parents understand how better to interact with their child. Our early Head Start programs. So Minnesota is one of a few states that actually contributes state dollars to supplement early Head Start. And actually fairly large number of children aged 0 to 3 are receiving early Head Start in Minnesota. And the reason why this program is so important is that it's really a model for what childcare should be. It focuses on the nurturing relationships between the caregiver and the child. It engages the family and helps identify the resources that the family needs and connects them with that. And it pays a lot of attention to caring for the actual childcare provider, the teacher, and that those are kind of the core elements of quality care. Our early intervention services, Minnesota is, we have kind of as a leader in early intervention services. And we've actually done a really good job of reducing gaps across race, ethnicity in early intervention. So I'm going to just go through that somewhat quickly. And then I want to spend just a minute on childcare subsidies. I know that you guys know childcare subsidies probably much better than I in terms of what's going on in your state. And I want to recognize that the data that I'm going to share with you was produced for a roadmap that came out in October and doesn't incorporate the changes that you made that were in effect in November, but I will speak to that. But our childcare subsidies are just a crucial element. Our childcare markets right now are struggling, to say the least. And our subsidies allow families to access care in a way that also promotes work and reduces the tension and stress in the household with regard to earnings and resources. So our childcare subsidies really are an important part of the system of care. And when states think about how they can invest dollars in childcare subsidies, they can do it based on who's eligible, how much the providers get so that they can pay their teachers and keep their doors open, and how much the family has to pay. So those kind of three elements are the way that we think about childcare subsidies. And in Minnesota, the federal government allows families up to states to provide subsidies to families who earn up to 85% of the state's median income. Pardon me, I can't speak this morning. Minnesota allows up to 47% of the state's median income. So more could be eligible if you wanted to spend your surplus dollars in those ways. And this is a very, very busy chart, but it just shows the variation across the country in how states decide what the providers are going to get and what the families have to pay. So in this shows you more in relation to states that are more closer to you. And that whole length of the bar is the 75th percentile. So that is the federal equal access target, that if we wanted to ensure that families had access to at least 75% of the market, that is what the reimbursement rate would be for providers, what they could collect. And Minnesota does not reimburse at that 75th percentile. That 75th percentile, keep in mind, is often much lower than what estimates say are necessary to really cover the true cost of care. That if we were to pay workers what they need, if we were to have the type of mental health consultants and other sorts of resources for childcare, that length of the bar would be even longer. But these are the old rates, remember, not the newer ones. But it demonstrates the variation. The first blue is what the state pays directly to the provider. That dark navy is the parent's copay. That is the fee that parents have to pay to the provider as well. And that turquoise blue or teal is more that indicates that difference between what the state reimburses the providers and that 75th percentile. So that's an out-of-pocket expense for families if they want to access higher quality care. And when we look at what I mentioned that length of the bar is not as long as what it might need to be to cover quality care, and even the base quality care, that length of Minnesota's bar based on the market rate survey is only about 80% of what would be needed to really cover, even just at a base level, that workers are getting $12 an hour and so forth for quality care. And when we look at the copayment, your copayment in Minnesota is actually relatively low. The federal government's guidelines are that it shouldn't be more than 7% of a family's income, and you're at 3% for the copay. But remember, you don't cover that full cost of care. So that limits families to being able only to access lower cost providers that often mean lower quality providers. And so if the family were to pay that full cost of care up to the 75th percentile, they would be paying 28% of that full cost. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I think you are all aware of, because you're largely responsible for it, probably, the changes that went into effect in November in terms of increasing the reimbursement rates, increasing from the 25th to the 40th percentile, and especially at the high quality reimbursement levels, that those were all increased. And I'm going to just illustrate to you now how, when we take all the things I looked at in the roadmap and the things that we can quantify, how that really combines to provide resources for a household. I'm going to just, in order to allow me to compare across states, I'm going to use a stylized family. This is a single mother who has an infant and a toddler, and she works full-time at the state's minimum wage. And in order to work full-time, she has to leave her children in care. And so she leaves them in center-based childcare that charges that 75th percentile of the market rate, that equal access target. So that's the mom that I'm comparing. And I'm going to just show you how Minnesota compares to Illinois and Wisconsin, just as a basis of comparison here. But you can see what the mom's earning, based on just her earnings alone, what that would look like in terms of resources in the household in Minnesota would be just over $22,000 a year, given the $10 an hour minimum wage. But now, remember, she has to access childcare. She has to pay for childcare. In order to go to this 75th percentile equal access center, you can see the kind of out-of-pocket childcare expenses really add up. And in Wisconsin, although the level of wages is very small because they only have the federal minimum wage, they have lower out-of-pocket childcare expenses. They have a slightly higher copay, but the difference in what they reimburse and what the market rate says is much smaller. And in Minnesota, though, because you don't cover up to the 75th percentile, that for her to access quality, she's really having to tap into a lot of her earnings. A lot of us would say, well, in order to work, I don't know that I could survive making only $14,000 a year after paying childcare. And I would either send them to lower quality care or I would cut back on work. Now let's add in the additional resources that she has available to her, both the nutrition supplements as well as the tax credits. And you can see that that really does play an important role in the overall resources that she has to provide for her families. And we're starting to close the gaps that the federal and state earned income tax credits and the WIC and nutrition supplements play a huge role in overall resources. And just this 1 year, 1 year only, because we did not make these permanent, the American Rescue Plan Act also plays such an important role. And if you look at the length of those purple bars, those are the benefits that the family gets this one time only. The lighter purple is that monthly child tax credit that we've all heard so much about. And the darker purple is the one that we haven't heard as much about, but that covers out-of-pocket childcare expenses. It is crucial that by April 18th, anyone who's eligible files for their federal income tax return and claims these credits, because half of that lighter purple will come back in a credit. Half of it went out in monthly payments, half of it's coming back in a credit, and all of that darker purple would come back in a credit, but only if they file for their income taxes. And a lot of lower income families think, well, I don't owe any taxes. Why would I file for my income tax? What a hassle. Well, right now they have thousands and thousands of dollars that they could claim back in this credit that would be help them to pay back some of the childcare expenses that they had and to help offset the loss of the monthly credit that they have moving forward. So just this is the difference in what it did in terms of when you increased the reimbursement rate, it really did put money into mom's pockets or the single mom's pockets, reducing those out-of-pocket childcare expenses. And when Minnesota, across the country, there is a huge variation in the level of resources that families have available to them based on the state's policy choices. It ranges from the same single mom who has access to more than $42,000 in the District of Columbia and less than $22,000 in North Carolina. And you can see where Minnesota is right there, kind of in the middle, with around $30,000 a year, if she claims everything that she is, eligible for. And so making sure that families get access to all the benefits that they're eligible for is an important part of this equation. So I'm going to stop here. I don't have to convince you how important the first 3 years are, but hopefully I've provided information on what the research says are the most effective ways that we can ensure that every child gets off to a healthy start and thrives. So thank you. And I'm
Thank you.
looking
Thank
forward to
you.
questions.
Thank you, Cynthia. We have some questions. I want to just start off with a question that maybe will involve a little help from Representative Pinto or Deb Fitzpatrick. But I wanted to follow up on the SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And I wondered if Minnesota had any changes in the works to make make SNAP be more effective, and whether this is a legislative decision or one that the administration could make. So just want to ask that question.
I'll let Representative Pinto, respond, because I apologize, I don't totally know. But it does. I know it varies across states in terms of being administrative or legislative. But Minnesota was one of few states last year that legislatively said we're going to do 12 months, which was important.
And I unfortunately, so I've come on just to, because my name was mentioned, though I have to say this is not an area that I have a great expertise to. I should say I'm Representative Dave Pinto, and nice to be with everybody. But it may be that we have someone else. I see Deborah Fitzpatrick is on, and she may be able to help us with this as we pass the hot potato.
Hi, everybody. Not my area of expertise either, but I believe my understanding is that we are going back to 6 months because there's a proposal on the table to align our TANF program, Minnesota Family Investment Program, with SNAP, and that is at a 6-month reporting level. So I'm not sure, Jane, whether they're will be anything there. I do know that one of the other things that Minnesota was a leader on, and that some have been advocating for, is the pandemic EBT, which is not SNAP, but it does allow families to access food during the summer and after school time and so on, and have more flexibility in terms of their ability to use those resources in ways that would better accommodate their families, and not make them have to go to a school site in order to receive food. So I do believe there are a variety of proposals on the table around food access coming off of the pandemic, and some of those may be beyond SNAP.
Very good. So this is one for Dr. Osborne. Is there a correlation for states that contribute funding to early Head Start? Do those states see more children being served? And are those states with the higher percentages of children overall served in the early care world?
Yeah, so there is a strong correlation between state level investment and the percentage of children served in early Head Start. As most of you are aware, Head Start and early Head Start are federal to local programs almost always. And there are a small handful of states, and Minnesota is one of them, that actually supplement state dollars and put state dollars into early Head Start, or are a grantee. They've actually applied to get the federal dollars directly, and then the state distributes them. There are other states that have invested in the early Head Start Child Care Partnership Program. And so these are all ways to try to expand the number of children who are served. There are also a handful of states, and we list them in the roadmap, that have developed their own program that either adopts or builds on, and may even have stronger standards in early Head Start. So in Nebraska, for instance, they've implemented the 6 Pence program. In Illinois, they do something that is similar to Head Start and early Head Start, but it is their kind of early intervention program, or I forget the exact name of it, but it's not Part C. It is early Head Start, but it's called something like early intervention. So there are myriad ways that states invest, but when states invest, it does enhance the number of children who are served.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So there's a question on what policies and practices best address the intersection between prenatal to 3 and child maltreatment, perhaps neglect even more than abuse. And I think you were referencing that a little bit ago, but talk more about where infants and toddlers especially need to be reached within a very short window of time to preserve the possibility of healthy development. So that's a big question, but take your time.
Yeah. Well, it is a big question, but it's so crucial because, so as I think most of you are aware, I mentioned about 75% of child welfare investigations have to do with what's deemed neglect as compared to abuse. And neglect can take on many forms, and some can be very, very serious. Those are usually because the parents have issues of substance misuse or depression, or experiencing their own violence or traumatic circumstances. There are the majority of cases, though, that have more to do with that the family has extreme instability in housing or food or finances, and it makes it so that they can't provide on a regular basis. So and that will make it so that their child might experience food insecurity and homelessness and so forth. And the policies that can address some of those upstream conditions that reduce those stressors on families are the ones that can reduce neglect. And that has to do with, you saw minimum wage actually is a strong predictor of neglect. So lower minimum wages have higher rates of child neglect, higher minimum wages, you see a reduction. We've also seen it in some of our more targeted interventions. So although it doesn't reach the level of significance required for our roadmap, the Family Connect study demonstrates that they are able to help to connect families to resources that reduce some of the stressors on families, and that they've shown a reduction in neglect for some of their families. We have seen that having access to healthcare can also help to reduce some of the medical neglect that is often associated with the child welfare system. So I could go on, but more resources mean fewer stressors, and more financial resources mean more stability in the household, and all of those things are going to, by and large, improve children's overall well-being.
Thank you. That's helpful. We have another thank you from one of our members in the audience about for the focus on paid family and medical leave and its impact. And a question in some ways rhetorical, but can we make sure to message this around the incredible positive impact on new babies, mothers, fathers, families, and employers, while a temporary leave from work is far from a break for a new parent? That we do know that. But I think it may be a question as well when you're looking at other states that have implemented a paid family medical leave, what are the messaging really matters in this. And so I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, I'm happy to, and also if Deborah wants to comment as well. And my apologies if I use the word giving mom a break. I now my children are older. They're 20 and 22, but certainly having a temporary leave from work does not mean that you are not working harder than you ever have or will in your entire life, especially while you're healing and transitioning to this new role. So my apologies if that's the language that I use. I didn't mean to minimize it. This is a program that, what I think about this, what the evidence shows with paid family leave is that it is one of the most pro-work policies that we have, as well as one of the most pro-family policies that we have. So it not only strengthens the attachment to the workplace that allows mothers to take that temporary leave, return to that same employment, and maintain more resources in the household. It also allows mothers time to heal emotionally as well as physically, but to bond more with the child and to increase that attachment and that certain return early on, as well as to take them to their medical appointments to get immunized and so forth. So, it is pro-work and pro-family, and has the research of that policy is kind of more profound, more robust than so many of our other policies. So I'll stop there, Deborah, if you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, really appreciate the comment and the question. I think this program is administered through the Department of Employment and Economic Development. So there has been kind of a fair amount of focus on the workforce side, workforce participation side. And we have been working to engage the early childhood community more deeply in this policy. So I do appreciate the question and invite the commenter to reach out and to get connected with the coalition. There's a coalition of around 50 organizations working to advance this, and increasingly early childhood focused organizations are part of that movement. And we want to just keep including more and more of that early childhood element. I think I just would speak and lift up Representative Damath and Representative Pinto on the Early Childhood Committee that had a joint hearing with the Workforce Development Committee in the House, which I think lifting up how this particular policy affects the future workforce as we think about, so not just helping mothers and fathers and other caregivers be part of the workforce, but also thinking, really long-term in the incredible investment that this is in our future workforce in terms of brain development in those first 1,000 days. And, I think that, again, the roadmap sort of points out how this particular policy has those very from across the lifespan impacts. So really appreciate that. And Renee, would invite you to be part of that conversation too. So feel free to reach out.
One thing I think that I want to just add that the elders, as you were talking about earlier, that you're not neutral on goals. And it's so that we're really talking about the goals, but that the elders have also observed that many childcare programs don't accept infants until they're 6 weeks old. And so there really creates a tremendous crisis in those early weeks. And we have a shortage of infant toddler care. So this is the point of wanting to create more stability in those early relationships. And this is, one major way to help. Yeah. And I don't know if that's factored in other states thinking about how they made their choices. So
with regard to the limits of infant care, it definitely helps in to reduce that pressure, but infant care remains scarce, even in states that have paid family leave relative to other care, but the pressure is reduced somewhat, but there's we just are more likely to accept 3 and 4 year olds than we are infants and toddlers, and childcare writ large. There's just more spaces.
This is a question that you were talking about. Lower cost care can sometimes mean lower quality. And we know that that isn't necessarily the case, but I think the question around preparing young children for school and how, if you have early care providers who may serve immigrants and refugees, is there any research about helping providers prepare the children they care for school in a pretty English dominated world?
Boy, oh boy.
A tough one.
It's a really important question. And I can kind of weave together some of the research from what I know, but whether it has been studied directly is, I'll have to look into more carefully. So I want to be careful of family-based childcare does not necessarily mean lower quality childcare, and center-based childcare does not necessarily mean higher quality childcare. On average, we see that the quality of care, when they've done studies, on average, the center-based care has higher quality ratings than family-based care. Now, most parents, especially for infants and toddlers, prefer family-based care. They prefer that intimate setting where they really feel like they know the provider, and that provider, they trust the provider. And this is even more true for families of color and for our immigrant families, where they want to be in a place that they trust, that the community knows, and that they believe will raise their child based on their own cultural norms and expectations. So the real question is, how do we support those and ensure the health and safety and cognitive and brain development stimulation that we need for all children. And we need to do this in our center-based care too, right? They're not, they often have higher levels of regulation and oversight, but there are several different initiatives that are trying to support family-based childcare. And whether there are those that are doing it well enough for immigrant families or refugee families or kind of ethnic enclaves, I'm not aware of what the most successful programs or initiatives are in that vein. But certainly that needs to be taken into consideration, because again, that's family's preference. It's often less expensive, and it doesn't have to mean lower quality. What's important for any time that a child is in any sort of care environment is that the provider and that child are engaged in these sorts of rich, nurturing relationships, and that back and forth serve and return. That the provider themselves has limited levels of stress, that they feel like they can do the job that they have. So they're paid well, their working conditions are strong. And that we know in center-based care when, and this happens more in family-based care, when there's engagement with the parent and meeting this parent's needs as well, that's another crucial element of quality, and that we're based on the science of learning through play. So all of those things will make it so the kids are thriving.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. And it kind of feeds into a question that's come in about, do you have data on the impact on babies and parents of color if they receive care and services from providers of their own race and culture? And that's what I'm also hearing you say. That's very important in the early years.
Yes, yes. The research on home visiting programs has been pretty strong, that cultural congruence really does help to improve parenting skills and knowledge about child development. That if the cultural congruence is stronger, that the parents are engaging more and learning more.
We're doing a scan of other questions. I'm just curious if I want to just point out that we will have this recording available within a week, and the slides will be coming up. And I think the other question I want to ask you, Dr. Osborne, is what are some of the events coming up with the center? You'll have a summit in the fall again. Is that some of the things? You don't have to know the dates, but just curious kind of what we look forward to.
Yeah, well, so I do, hopefully Eileen, who is on this call with me, has shared with you all our website, and I would encourage you, a little self-promotion plug here, but to sign up for our listserv, because that is where all of our new reports and announcements for anything are coming out. Also, another little shameless thing, we are hiring, so anyone who is really interested in early childhood policy and or working with states and understanding what states are doing, please apply to some of our positions. In our transition, we're starting anew for many, and remote possibilities are available. We will have our summit in the fall, and although the details, Eileen might be having a heart attack thinking about what I might be saying right now. The details are not final and are subject to change, but we will have a virtual summit in which we will release updates to the roadmap that will show us kind of how states did during this legislative session in terms of moving forward an early childhood agenda. And we will be demonstrating one of the new elements that we're adding into the roadmap is that we're really counting the impact of the policy change. So if you increase your minimum wage, if you increase your reimbursement level for your childcare subsidies, we want to demonstrate like what that dollar amount is and how many students, how many children or families benefited from that. And so we'll really try to put a number to those changes. And then our hope is also to bring together a limited number of states where we would bring you all, everyone come to Vanderbilt or to Nashville, and we would spend a few days really thinking through how to use the data that we have, the information expertise that you have as state leaders, and work jointly on you kind of setting your early childhood agenda. And you would have other states that you would be able to learn from and build on. So all of those are coming in hopefully October, November, and we'll have other new things coming out throughout the summer. So please join our list.
Sounds wonderful. Well, here's another question for you. Could you talk about the data that, what data exist about reading to children every day, and if so, where that data would come from, and the importance of reading to little kids every day? Do you have?
Yeah, so we actually have one of the outcome indicators is the percentage of children who are read to daily. And this is data that comes from the National Child Health Survey. I forget, the National Survey of Child Health or something like that. I can get the link in it, and it's in our outcomes table that I showed you. And the reason that we have that in there is for a couple of reasons. One, we do know that reading with your child is not only important for kind of hearing new words and learning the literacy skills and language development, that does matter. That is a huge thing. Reading from birth on, kids who experience this, especially on a daily basis, have richer language skills by the time that they enter pre-K and or kindergarten. But in addition, it also illustrates the proportion of parents who have the time and capacity and resources to do that. And it is not an easy thing to do for parents who are working, parents who have lots of other things going on in their lives. And so it really also speaks to that kind of ability for parents to engage in those nurturing behaviors. Because as those of you who have read to your kids or grandkids or other young children, you know that they don't care what you're actually saying in the story sometimes, right? What it is you're sitting on your lap and they're looking at the pictures together. You're giving them the opportunity to hold a book and work on their gross and fine motor skills and turn a page and remember my kids could read all the books back to me, like they would memorize all the words for all of them. And it's that sort of engagement that matters so much. So when we're thinking about reading, it's important that people aren't just thinking, I just need my kids to hear these words and that's going to do build their literacy skills. It's that engagement. And so this is a signal of the parents who have the capacity to do that. And if they don't, there's usually outside stressors that are making that not possible. And the number of kids who are kind of in that sort of environment and getting those early nurturing relationships. So yes, we track it. It is self-report. So, we don't, but it's over time across states. So it's pretty good data.
Well, you've built an amazing resource for all of us. And I want to just close with one question about the fact that Minnesota has we have metro and then we have more what we call greater Minnesota or rural, and whether there's how you might evaluate differences, or maybe it'll be something that Minnesota needs to engage in, how we evaluate our own resources, which seem more rich, more depth, have more depth in the metro than outstate. And yet, how do we look at that? And that might be something for us to consider. So any advice or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. So we do look at state averages, but we recognize that the average in the state speaks to exactly no one, right? Because no one's average. But so in Texas, for instance, we're working with their Prenatal 3 collaborative to develop a state-specific data, look that we'll take all of the national data that we have and break it up to its smallest increment that we can, because although Texas is huge, it has this urban-rural issue quite a bit in the availability of resources and who lives there and what the outcomes look like varies so much, and as I'm sure they do in Minnesota. The data are not always as robust when you start to break it up across county or zip code, or even by race ethnicity. We need better data. So I want to encourage states to be collecting, using your own data as much as possible, or we can work with you to look at those data. But it is so important that we have a better understanding of whether what we're doing is impacting the well-being of all kids, which would mean that we need to reduce disparities so that everyone's thriving. But it's so important, and I wish that we could speak to it more. The data just don't allow for it.
Well, we're on a learning journey, and we thank you for joining us today. And thanks to your team, and we really look forward to working more with you and hearing and learning more. We, the elders, have talked with our other parts of the team about making the framework of the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center state roadmaps be part of our own framework, and so that we continue to really use this opportunity in a way that makes sense and teaches us. So thank you, Dr. Osborne. Thank you again. We really appreciate it. And to our listening audience, just remember, this is the final virtual forum, and we will be in person July 13th. And Representative Pinto and Representative Damath have both had to check out. So we are without them, and we want to say on their behalf, thank you, and look forward to next time. And watch your inboxes. We'll be sending some links to you following the forum for our YouTube channel, etc. Have a good remainder of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.